Hello, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll be painting this beautiful loose watercolor floral composition with some roses, filler flowers, and greenery, and I'll share the process step by step. So let's get started. As always, the supplies I'm using in this tutorial are all linked down below if you'd like to check them out. We're going to start by painting the three primary roses, and I'm using the Daniel Smith Paraline Maroon, and I just painted my nails a very similar dark maroon color, so I thought it'd be fun to match them to this painting. Alright, so let's go ahead and start with the very first rose. You can use whatever color you'd like, and if you've watched any of my other tutorials with roses in them, or you've taken my rose classes, you know that I always start with a very pigmented mixture and the very tip of my brush, and I'm going to start with the top left flower. So we're doing 3 flowers, top left, middle right, and bottom left. So when I do my roses, I start very pigmented, and I use just the very tip of my brush to make little tiny C strokes. And C strokes just means it's in the shape of the letter C. And I just do that for the very first center of my rose. So just these little tiny strokes, and I'm leaving a bit of white space in the middle. I don't want it to turn into a blob of color, just like that. And that'll serve as the center of our rose. And then I'm going to go ahead and rinse off my brush so that all I have is clear water in my bristles. And I'm going to start feathering the edges of these. So just doing those same C strokes, but just outlining the edge, and you can see that color start to bleed out and create these really beautiful soft petals. So rinsing off my brush in between and continuing to feather those out. And I'm starting to apply more pressure as I work my way to the outer edge of the rose. So those inner strokes are very tight, they're very thin. I'm using the tip of my brush. And then as I work my way out, I start applying more pressure, my strokes are getting thicker, and I'm creating these big fluffy petals. And again, making sure to leave a little bit of white space here so that it's not just one big blob. You want to have a little bit of separation in your petals. And I'm just going to add these very light, watery strokes just on the very outer edge. So now while the layers are still wet, I like to go back in with a very dark pigment and just tap in just a little bit of color, and you can start to see it create those beautiful bleeds back into those petals. So just using the very tip of my brush and gently tapping that in. I'll move you in a bit closer so you can see it better. Just using the tip and gently tapping in that color, and you can see it expand out into the petal. And I don't want to overdo it because I still would like to maintain that dark to light depth and that gentle gradient, but I'm just adding a little bit of that here and there, adding a few more strokes around the outside, and just kind of deepening the petals a little bit. All right, so our first rose is complete. I like how that one looks, and now we're going to do another rose a little bit down and a little bit to the right. So when you're doing compositions, you never want to have your primary elements stacked up. Like I wouldn't want to do one right next to it on the side or right below it, just because it would look a little uneven and unbalanced, and you want to have a little variety and movement to your composition. So that's just something you'll want to keep in mind as you plan out where those primary elements will be. And we'll do the same process for the second rose. So again, starting with a lot of pigment in my brush, I'm basically pulling straight from the color and just using the tip of my brush to create those very fine strokes, leaving some white space in between them. And that's the center of our rose. And then I rinse off my brush completely so that I have clean bristles. I have a decent amount of water in my bristles, but not so much to where it's gonna flood the surface or where water's dripping off. I just want enough to be able to feather out those petals, still using those C strokes, still leaving that white space between the petals, and just gradually working my way around this rose. And you can see I'm making pretty quick strokes. I'm not worrying about making the perfect petal shape or making sure every petal looks the exact same. I'm just kind of making those little flicks with the tip of my brush and then applying more pressure for those thicker outer petals. And I don't even think I'm going to go in with a second layer on this one. There's already some gradual bleeds going on, and so I'm just going to go ahead and add my third flower. And I like working with simple colors personally, so I'm going to use that same exact color for this third one. But if you'd like to mix it up, you're more than welcome to. So just doing the same little C strokes, it's the same exact process as we've done. Starting with those wispy little dainty lines, rinsing off my brush, and then feathering out those petals. All right, so our three primary elements are done. So the next step will be adding our first little bit of greenery. And I always like to work light to dark. So I'm gonna be adding a few bigger, lighter leaves, and then we'll add the rest of our dark maroon filler flowers. And then we will finish up with adding some more movement with greenery. So let's go ahead and start with that first layer of leaves. So I'm gonna start with a size 8 brush, so it's slightly bigger. And like I said, I'm going to be working light to dark, so I'm going to start with a pretty light value of green. And lighter value just means it's more watered down, it's not as concentrated. And I want these to be kind of bigger leaves. They're not going to be very visible because they're very light value, but you want to add some depth. And so I like to add these lighter background leaves, and then we'll add darker leaves on top. So you can see how light this leaf is. It's almost barely visible. They don't have to be perfect because they're so light. They're just going to provide a nice little background layer and add some depth to the overall composition. So if yours are starting to look too dark, just go ahead and add some water to your mixture so you can keep it nice and light. And I do have another couple of YouTube videos on painting leaves and greenery, so I will link to that up at the top if this is challenging for you. But I'm just applying some pressure down on my brush and letting the bristles expand and then lifting back up to create the pointy tip of these leaves. And I usually do groups of 2 or 3 and I add a little bit of movement to them. But again, I'm not too worried about exactly where I'm placing these because we'll be putting some more elements with the filler flowers and additional greenery on top of it. All right, so that's good for that first little layer. Again, it's just kind of a background to add some depth. So you don't want these leaves to be too punchy because we want to leave room to add darker elements on top without it being too busy. So at this point, I'm going to add a little bit of darker filler flowers, and I'm using this very dark value of the Perylene Maroon. So this will really match my nails. And when I add filler flowers like this, I usually like to just use a pencil and just kind of pencil in where I want that movement to be. It's not any intense sketching or anything like that. I still want the strokes to be nice and loose, but I just like to kind of visualize where I want these filler flowers to be. And that way, if I pencil it in and it looks weird or wonky, it's just pencil. So let's see, I want this movement. It already has some good movement from top left to bottom right. So let's just pencil in those fillers. And you're more than welcome to add these elements wherever you'd like. You don't have to feel like you're doing it exactly how I'm doing it. But I'll have some coming out of the top. I'll also probably have it just a little bit here at the bottom. I'll have some coming up on the sides. And again, don't worry about overlapping that base layer of leaves. The filler flowers are going to be a lot darker, so you can always layer from light to dark. So don't be afraid of overlapping. And let's see, I might also have a stem coming up right here. just curling around the right edge. So you can see just very light pencil marks, and that just helps me kind of get a feel for how many elements I'm going to add and where I'm going to place them. So now I'm going to move to a pretty small brush. It's a size 4, and I'll load up quite a saturated dark value of the maroon. But whatever color you use, you're more than welcome to use other colors, but I like to just kind of pull that darkest color value from the center of the rose. And I'm just gonna add some little buds here. So I don't have a structure or a brush stroke for these. I just kind of place my brush down like that. Sometimes I'll do a couple strokes, and it just creates these little buds and fun organic shapes. There's no perfect way to do it. I just kind of place my brush down and let it make these unique little marks. And I want to maintain that movement. So I'm making sure I'm not lining them up perfectly. I'm going to have some kind of falling downwards like this. And just following that curve that I penciled in. And again, you can see I'm overlapping this light green leaf here, which is totally fine because the maroon color is so much darker than the light green. So that just helps to build in some more depth. And it looks a little funky right now because there's no stem attaching any of it, but it'll start to fall into place once we add those stems. But for now, I'm just going to work my way around the painting, following where I place those little pencil marks and adding in some of these fillers. Again, it's not a perfect flower petal, it's not a perfect bud, it's just kind of these dainty little marks, and you can even use the tip of your brush to add some little dots. These are just fillers to help beef up the composition a little bit, so it does not have to be perfect, but I do want to maintain that movement to it. So as I do this, I'm just kind of using that brush to my advantage. I'm not even doing full brush strokes. I'm just kind of plopping the brush down on the paper and letting it create these organic shapes. And now we can do the finishing touches. So I'm going to move to a size 2 round brush so that I have a nice fine tip. And I'm going to go ahead and connect all of these stems. So just using the very tip of my brush, not applying too much pressure down, and maintaining that movement and the curve. And just adding in these little wispy stems. So we'll start with that, and then we'll add some more greenery. So just the very tip of my brush and connecting these little buds. I want to maintain a pretty fine stem, so I'm not putting too much pressure on my brush. But for now, all I'm doing is connecting these. And maintaining that good arch and curve to it, because that's what's going to give this composition all of the movement. Okay, so now we have our primary elements, we have the background leaves, and we have our filler flowers. So now it's just going in and adding the final little touches of leaves and greenery. So I'm going to use a medium value, not as dark as I did for the stem, but definitely darker than that first layer of leaves. And I'm just going to start filling in some more of these. So again, I like to layer, so I will add some here on top, applying some pressure down, and I actually want that leaf to be a little bit darker, so I'm going to deepen my value a little bit and go over it. And I'll have another one coming off to the side. Again, I don't want to overwork it, but I do want to make sure that the composition is nice and full. That's a little stroke that I like to do in a lot of my pieces, is just add those little thin and wispy marks. Makes it look a little more interesting. So applying some pressure down, lifting back up to get the fine tip of that leaf. And I'm just kind of filling it out. Feel free to make your own creative choices here. You don't need to add leaves exactly where I'm adding them. I want you to make this composition your own and start experimenting with your own creative choices. And do your best not to overwork it. Sometimes with compositions like this, it can be easy to just kind of get lost in adding more fillers and adding more greenery and leaves. I personally have a habit of doing that. So it's just helpful sometimes to take a step back every now and then, look at your painting from afar, and do your best not to add too much. And this is one of the reasons why I absolutely love the Neptune brushes from Princeton, because they're just so thirsty, and I know I say that in every video, but they are, and it just makes painting florals and greenery so easy because you can just plop your brush down like this and it creates such a beautiful, organic, loose style shape that I absolutely love. You can also try adding some variation, so you can use your tip of your brush to create a little stem like that, and maybe just add some little leaves coming off of that. Just have fun with it and see what you can add to make your painting a little more interesting. And at the end, I really like to just go in with a very deep dark color. I added a little bit of black to my mixture and a little bit of brown, and really just deepened that value. And I'm deepening just some of these leaves, not all of them, because I do want to maintain that depth and that transition from light to dark, but I'm just picking out some little areas to really make some of these strokes stand out. And make sure you're also taking a step back and evaluating maybe what needs a little darker elements. So for example, if the top right was looking too busy, you could add some more stuff to the left side, or if a particular area is looking a little lighter, then you can go over it and make it a bit darker. Just kind of take a step back every now and then, look at your painting from afar, and see what can enhance it a bit. And also remember, you don't want to overdo it, which I think is what I'm starting to do, but it's very hard to stop. So I'm just going to deepen a couple more of these little leaves and then I will call it good. And the last thing I like to do is to deepen the roses a little bit more. So I am just going to use a very small brush. This is the size 2 round brush. And I'm going to go directly into that maroon color from my palette. I'm also going to add a little bit of carbon black. So it's a very deep pigment. And I'm just using the very tip of my brush to deepen that very center of the rose, making wispy little strokes. I don't want to overpower it because I do still like that very loose, romantic, floaty, kind of soft look of these. So I don't want to overdo it, but I'm just deepening that very center. And I will do it to all the roses. And this just helps to kind of build up that depth a little more. And I'm using the wet on dry technique because this is wet paint on my brush, but the rose underneath it is already dry. So wet on dry is usually used just to add those final details and extra touches to your painting. And this rose is a little bit washed out, so I'm also just going to add a little bit of layers, just some medium value strokes on the outside as well. Again, I don't want to overdo it, but this particular rose was a little too light for my liking. So that is the best part of watercolor, is you can always reactivate things, you can add more layers on top, and it stays very flexible. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I do have quite a few in-depth floral watercolor classes if you'd like to continue practicing and learning new techniques and I'll share the link to all of my classes in the description box. Thank you so much for watching. I had a lot of fun painting alongside you today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.